Hi everybody and welcome back to the Coderoom. Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a very important property that's going to lead to some very, very powerful CSS styling, okay? And that property is called display, okay? So this actually applies to almost every element in HTML, okay? You can actually apply this CSS property to almost every element in HTML. And certain elements that we're going to use in the future, like div and span, have some important default values for this display property, okay? So let me tell you what I'm talking about. Okay, so when we talk about headers, paragraphs, links, and all these things like that, most of these elements, if not all of these elements, can actually have a CSS property called display, okay? Now, this display can take in a couple of different values, okay? But there's three I really want to concentrate on right now, okay? The first one is called inline, okay? The second one is called block, okay? And the third one is called inline block, all right? Now display can actually have a lot of other different values, but today we're just concentrating on these three values, okay? So again, it's inline, block, and display block. And I want to show you roughly how these guys behave, okay? So let's talk about inline, okay? So let's say you had a link that's sitting inside a piece of paragraph text, okay? So let's say, let's take our code here, and let's say, we have our text here, okay? Just shrinking the text. We have our text, and let's say in the middle of this text, you want to put a link. So somewhere in here, let's say you were to put a link in here, all right? Something like that, okay? So how would that element behave inside this text, okay? It all depends on the display property, all right? So the way that inline works, if your element display is inline, then your element will be rendered onto the HTML page inline, within the line of the text, okay? So it doesn't start a new line. Wherever the HTML elements are right now, it's just gonna append it to that, okay? So if you had the text, if you want some more information, click, and then you had a link called here, it would just render it right beside click, and then the text that comes after it, it would render it right afterwards, okay? That's what display inline is. And links by default are display inline, okay? And paragraph text, the text inside the paragraph itself by default is inline, okay? The next one is block, okay? And the way that block works is you picture that the element will take up a block of the web page, okay? So if your display is set to block, then that HTML element will actually take up an entire block of the page, spanning the entire width of the page, okay? So if you want more information, click, and then here was a link with the display value block, it would actually start a new line, okay? And take up the entire width of that page. Now, you wouldn't see this with your bare eye, but if you were to play around with its background or its border or anything like that, okay, you would see that effect there. All right, and then the text after that starts on the line after that because this block is taking up the entire width of the page, okay? Now there are certain elements that by default are a display block. Header is a good example, okay? If you look at the header that we were building, the header actually takes up the entire width of the page in its own line, okay? So by default, that's actually set to block, all right? Now, the really interesting difference between inline and block is that block has a lot of properties that you can play with that inline doesn't, okay? You can play with things like margins and padding, okay? Which you can't do with inline, and that is what this is all leading to. I'm about to teach you guys something called the box model, which we'll get into, okay? But for now, just understand for inline, it renders it right within the text. For block, it takes up a new line and takes up the entire width, okay? And the last thing is called inline block. And what inline block does, okay, is it still renders your element in line, but gives you access to these properties like padding and margin, okay? So let's just do a brief demonstration of this, okay? So let's go into here. Let's go to our very top thing here, okay? So we have movies have always been a big part of my life, okay? And let's put a link inside this lorem ipsum text, okay? So let's put a link right in the middle of all this, okay? So test link, okay, and we'll point it to nowhere right now. Okay, so let's save that. And we haven't changed this, our styling, we'll just leave it as default. Okay, so I'll refresh the page. And you'll see the test link is directly inside the text here, okay? Actually, let's put a space after it as well. Okay, there we go. So by default, links actually have a display of inline, so they just appear right within line within the text. All right, so let's change it. Let's change it to display block and see what happens. Okay. Now, if I save that and refresh it, you'll see what happens. So I have movies that have always been part of my life, lorem ipsum, da-da-da, and then the link actually starts on the next line. And you can't see it, but the element is actually taking up the entire width of the page, okay? And that's why the text after that's being pushed onto the element below. If you want to see this in action, let's actually put a background to it, and you can actually see what I'm talking about, okay? So let's put a background to this link here. And let's make it background red. Okay. So refresh, and you'll see it right there. So that HTML element, even though the test link is only taking up the left side of the space, is actually taking up the entire width of this, okay? And that's what display block does. Let's go back to display inline to show you how it looks. So we'll just get rid of display block, and by default display inline, refresh, and there you go. So it only takes up that little space. All right, and then when you go display block, it takes up that entire width, okay? So that's the difference between inline and block. Now what about inline block? So if we do inline dash block, okay, it'll actually look very similar to display inline, but it now actually has access to some extra properties, which we'll talk about in the future, okay? So again, so the difference between, all right, so that's the difference between inline, block, and display block, all right? And this all becomes very important in the next lesson when we talk about the box model. All right, we'll see you guys in the next one.